Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In this video, we are going to discuss some major crises in colonial American history: wars, rebellions, moral panics, and religious uprisings, and how these tumultuous and often traumatic events helped to forge a new and unified colonial American identity, inspiring the American Revolution. Because of this lecture's longue durée approach, there will be some chronological overlap between this lecture and our previous discussions about the founding of the English American colonies. I will offer some review, but will try to keep the repetition to a minimum in this video. First, we will go back to Virginia, around the year 1675. The colony had not changed very much since the founding of Jamestown back in 1607, although it had grown larger. The colony continued to import European indentured servants to provide labor in the colony's tobacco fields and workshops. African enslaved people were brought in as well, but many of them worked more as indentured servants, like their European counterparts. As you remember from a previous video, the living conditions of the first indentured servants were awful, with floggings, disease, and a lack of food and medical care. These abuses caused many servants to die before they could gain their freedom. Additionally, indentured servants had few political rights, and often had their contracts extended as punishment for minor offenses. By the 1670s, though, conditions for indentured servants were beginning to improve. More and more indentured servants were surviving their contracts, which is great if you're an indentured servant. Additionally, colonists and servants living in the interior of Virginia, away from the fetid swamps of the Tidewater region, were less likely to be killed by disease. Colonists that lived longer were able to have more children, and the colony began to grow its population through natural increase, in addition to immigration. The growth of the free Virginian population, combined with the indentured servants' increased survival, meant that there was not enough land for the Virginia colony's residents. These colonists would have to move further into the interior and settle on Native American land if they were to sustain themselves. This encroachment worried the colony's elite residents, especially Virginia's governor, Sir William Berkeley. Governor Berkeley viewed Native Americans as a valuable trading partner, buying fur pelts from them, which he would sell in Europe for a hefty profit. The colonists had been fighting with Native Americans, primarily the Doeg and the Rappahannock people, and this war threatened the governor's trade, which had made him very rich. Both sides attacked their rivals' communities, and the colonists' goal eventually became to remove these Indians from Virginia. Naturally, the governor refused to provide military support against his trading partners. In response, Nathaniel Bacon, a plantation owner who had previously been snubbed by Berkeley, led the colonists on a campaign against the Indians, in which they violently forced most of the Native Americans, even the ones that had supported them, out of the state and into Maryland. After defeating the Indians, Bacon turned his soldiers eastward, attacking the plantations around Jamestown. Bacon's army, which included free colonists, as well as white and black indentured servants, even burned Jamestown, forcing Governor Berkeley and his gentry followers to flee to sea. The rebels' grievances were as follows. Governor Berkeley unfairly taxed rural colonists without offering them military aid against Native Americans. 2. Governor Berkeley was corrupt, giving political positions to his friends instead of people like Nathaniel Bacon. 3. Governor Berkeley monopolized the fur trade for his own benefit. 4. Governor Berkeley cared more about Native Americans than he did his own colonists. And 5. The governor had taken away the voting rights of lower-class colonists. The rebel colonists had defeated Berkeley, but their uprising ultimately failed when Bacon suddenly came down with an illness and died. Without a leader, the rebellion dissipated, and 23 of its leading members were executed. Although Bacon's rebellion was short-lived and a failure in the end, it had profound effects, both positive and negative, on the development of the Virginia colony. On the positive side, the rebellion convinced the House of Burgesses, Virginia's legislative body, that they ought to give the colonists more political rights. Male colonists, who had lost their right to vote, were permitted to vote again, so long as they were free. The House of Burgesses lowered taxes as well in a series of acts that became known as Bacon's Laws. More dubiously, the Virginian government would take a more aggressive stance against Native Americans, offering increased military support to colonists who had settled in Indian country. Most problematically, though, was how Bacon's rebellion changed Virginia's labor structure. Before the rebellion, most of Virginia's labor had been done by indentured servants, both white and black. The temporary nature of this enslavement, combined with the freedom dues, namely land that were owed to newly free servants, had caused colonial Virginians to settle on Native American lands, which had been the flashpoint that started the rebellion. Additionally, the white Virginian gentry fearfully observed how poor whites and blacks had made common cause against the colony's elite. Virginia's wealthy residents realized their hegemony would be threatened if the lower classes rose up against them. Consequently, the elite began to rely more on race-based chattel slavery through the importation of enslaved Africans, who would be slaves for life. The Virginian elite preferred that the lower orders of society be divided over race rather than class. They wanted poor whites to identify more with their own race, rather than people of a different race who had a more similar economic situation. To this end, the House of Burgesses in 1705 passed a series of slave codes that defined blacks as inferior to whites, instituting white supremacy into Virginian colonial law. In conclusion, Bacon's rebellion, though brief, was a significant moment in Virginian and colonial history as a whole. It signaled the beginning of the end of the indentured servitude in the colonies in favor of African slavery. It also racialized colonial Virginian society, dividing white and black colonists along the lines of race, associating whiteness with freedom and blackness with slavery. This racialized, quote-unquote, white over black system would become the norm throughout the plantation colonies, from Maryland all the way down to Georgia, creating the southern-northern dichotomy that we know today in the English colonies. Bacon's rebellion was an incredibly significant crisis in colonial American history, with many long-term effects. Now we will turn our attention to another set of crises, all of which took place in New England: King Philip's War, King William's War, and the Salem witch trials. As you know from our previous videos, the New England colonies were founded primarily by Puritans, or English Christians with similar religious views, with some exceptions like Rhode Island. The colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut were the best examples of this trend. You will also remember that Puritans were not the only people who settled in the New England colonies. Religious dissidents came to New England and established the Rhode Island colony, as mentioned before, but many more dissidents just stayed in the Puritan colonies, leading to compromises between the Puritans and the dissenters, like the Halfway Covenant of the 1660s, which made church membership easier for non-Puritans, as we discussed in a previous video. In the 1670s and 1680s, the New England colonies experienced a series of political changes that further undermined the religious leadership and prestige in North America. The first conflict was King Philip's War of 1675 to 1676. This conflict saw the 50-plus year peace between Plymouth and the Wampanoag Indians come to an end. The war's causes were numerous and complex, and had about as much to do with cultural differences between Native Americans and the English colonists as they did over land and economic concerns. King Philip, or Metacom, chief of the Wampanoag people, was angry that many of his people were being converted to Christianity at praying towns, missions established by the Plymouth colonists. Converted natives, called quote-unquote praying Indians, often moved into the colonial settlements and lived more like Europeans than Indians. Plymouth and other English colonists were also not willing to have free trade with the Wampanoag. In particular, they made it illegal to sell the Wampanoags guns. One such praying Indian, John Sassamon, a graduate of Harvard University and a cultural mediator between the Wampanoag and Plymouth, was killed. The Plymouth colonists arrested several Wampanoags, including Philip, for the murder of Sassamon. While Philip was allowed to go free, 3 of his people were convicted of murder by a white and Native American jury. The execution of the Wampanoag warriors inspired the Wampanoags and their allies to begin attacking English settlements across the frontier, bringing the war to all of the New England colonies. Initially, the colonial militias, staffed by colonial men armed with personal muskets, struggled to defend their settlements or strike Native American communities. The militiamen fought in close order drills and made themselves easy targets for Wampanoag ambushes. Additionally, they often used cheap, old-fashioned matchlock muskets rather than new and more reliable flintlocks, which were not as cumbersome to operate. The militias performed far better when they were deployed alongside their own native allies, the Mohegans, who taught the Englishmen the quote-unquote skulking way of war, moving through the woods in small raiding parties that could evade enemy ambushes in order to strike at enemy settlements. The English contributed their own strategy of targeting Native American logistics, decisively burning down their settlements and food stores in order to force their Native American enemies to surrender. The war mostly ended around 1676 with the death of Metacom, or King Philip, but low-level raids continued on the frontier for the rest of the 1600s. The war was disastrous for the Plymouth colonists, leading to the colony's absorption into Massachusetts in 1691. The war was even worse for the Wampanoag, who were forced to leave their homelands and move west. The English colonists also sold about 2,000 Wampanoag prisoners of war to foreign slave traders. While Native Americans had fought on both sides during this conflict, King Philip's War continued the trend of the colonies-wide racialization of Native Americans, casting indigenous people as enemies of white English civilization. King Philip's War, while it was an English victory, weakened New England as a whole, allowing the British Empire to take more control over these fairly autonomous colonies. King James II of England vacated Massachusetts' colonial charter in 1684 and turned the disparate New England colonies into the Dominion of New England, ruled by Sir Edmund Andros. James II was trying to bring the American colonies under more centralized imperial British control, something that angered the English colonists, who had fled England because they detested British coercion. James II was also a Catholic, which angered Protestants across all of colonial America, as they feared that a Catholic monarch would persecute them, just as Mary I had done about a century earlier. James II would be forced out of England during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689, and England will be taken over by Mary II, James's daughter, and William III, King of the Netherlands. The Glorious Revolution spilled over into the American colonies, helping to inspire the Puritan takeover of Catholic Maryland, which we discussed in a previous video. While some people might see the Glorious Revolution as a hostile Dutch takeover of England, the English colonists tended to support William and Mary because of their Protestant bona fides and their transformation of the English crown into a constitutional monarchy. In spite of the Protestant victory during the Glorious Revolution, English colonists remained hyper-vigilant, fearing Catholics and popish plots to take over their colonies. Additionally, a conflict with Catholic France, called King William's War, helped to make Catholics not only a spiritual threat, but a military one as well. King William's War of 1688 through 1697 was the first of a series of 4 French and Indian Wars, in which the French colonies and their Native American allies made war on the English colonists. The English had Amerindian allies as well, but in general, more tribes supported the French because of France's trade-based approach to colonization, which we've discussed in a previous video. King William's War was especially poignant for New Englanders, who saw their settlements attacked by French and Indian, primarily Abenaki, raiding parties. The conflict ended in a draw, with neither side gaining anything from the violence. This conflict, like King Philip's War, continued to transform Native Americans into a dangerous other who would side with the colony's biggest colonial enemy, the French. With this background out of the way, you can see the precarious position in which the Puritan New England elite found themselves in the 1690s. A decade of warfare and political intrigue had left them suspicious and paranoid, suspicious of Catholics, suspicious of Indians, and suspicious of British imperial takeover. Events in the spring and summer of 1692 would give nervous Puritans something tangible onto which they could project their fears. In the small town of Salem, just outside of Boston, people began having strange dreams, what we might call hallucinations today. To this day, we do not know what exactly caused these hallucinations and mass psychosis. Some scholars think that rye that had been contaminated by ergot fungus caused the hallucinations, as ergot-laced grain has been found to have caused similar psychotic events in medieval Europe. Others think that the dreams were made up, and that the Puritans of Salem used the accusation of witchcraft to remove troublesome people from their communities. Still others think that some of the dreams were real and some were fake, and that the paranoia of the Salem witch trials was inspired as much by the fear of Indians and Catholics as it was by events within the Salem community. Nonetheless, witchcraft was the easiest and most tangible explanation that the Puritan colonists would have had for the strange things that were happening in Salem. The Salemites quickly pointed fingers at a local woman named Tituba, a slave of Afro-Caribbean and Native American ancestry, who had been brought to Salem from the West Indies. Tituba confessed that she had engaged in acts of divination, but the accusations continued and soon included other women and men in the town. Over 100 people would be accused of witchcraft during the trials. Most of the accused, over 3/4, were female, and they tended to be poor, outcast, and chronically destitute women who were disliked within the Salem community. One example of the early accused was Sarah Good, who was financially destitute and had previously been accused of sexual immorality. Another woman, Sarah Osborne, had hitherto been accused of being a busybody and not minding her place as a woman. As a widow, Osborne remarried an indentured servant and had denied her son his deceased father's inheritance, contributing to this accusation. As spring wore on into the summer, the accusations became wilder and more sensational and grew to encompass more people. The Puritans had previously banished women who had not kept to the colony's gender norms, as was done with Anne Hutchinson in 1637. But witchcraft was a capital offense in Massachusetts. During the summer, women who were of higher moral character, not community pariahs, also began to be accused of the crime of witchcraft. How did the Salem witch trials work? How could a court believe it could prosecute something as unverifiable as witchcraft? A person who believed that they had been afflicted by a witch because they had had a mysterious dream or believed they had been haunted by demonic spirits would go to the Salem court and make a petition to Samuel Sewall, the magistrate. The accused witch would be brought before the court, and evidence, including spectral testimony, dreams, would be presented by the plaintiff against the defendant. The court also admitted other types of evidence that were based on centuries-old English folk spiritual beliefs, what we might call ordeals today. The court would view the defendant's plea of innocence as evidence of their guilt, since witchcraft was communication with the devil, and the devil, according to Christian tradition, was the father of lies. On this kind of evidence, which was considered dubious even in the 1600s, 19 people were executed and 1 man was crushed to death with rocks. Unlike in Europe, the accused witches were hung rather than burned. The Salem witch trials came to an end in the fall of 1692, as public opinion in New England turned against the trials. It is worth noting, though, that there were additional trials in early 1693. But for the purpose of this class, we will define the end of the trials as being in 1692. In the years after the famous Salem witch trials, the judges, prosecutors, and supporters of the courts did everything they could to disassociate themselves from the bloody affair. Samuel Sewall, the Salem magistrate, apologized for his role in the trials and believed that the death of his children was punishment from God for his role as judge during the whole affair. Reverend Cotton Mather, an early supporter of the trials, an advocator of the use of spectral evidence, later condemned the trials as being violent, superstitious, and unchristian. Although the Salem witch trials did not cause the Puritans to abandon their faith, scholars have argued that the trials and their fallout led to the end of Puritan theocratic government in New England, helping to inspire an increased desire for religious toleration and a separation of church and state. The Salem witch trials greatly weakened theocracy in the American colonies. But out of this decline of religious rule, a new Christian religious fervor called the First Great Awakening began. The First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1750s took place throughout the American colonies, and also in England as well. The awakening saw the democratization of Christianity, and the transition away from old Puritan ideals in England and old Anglican beliefs in the South, in favor of smaller, dissident branches of Christianity, like the Baptists and the Methodists. In New England, the First Great Awakening weakened the Puritan or Congregationalist churches, drawing members to newer and more vibrant sects. In the South, the First Great Awakening led frontier Christians in the Appalachian backcountry to separate themselves from the Anglican Church favored by the Eastern planter elite. Across the colonies, itinerant preachers like Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, and George Whitefield spread Christian teaching to the frontier, preaching sermons to unchurched frontier settlers. These preachers emphasized the importance of emotion in Christianity, as well as the need to confess one's sin to God in order to receive salvation, which is called Arminianism in Christian theology. The Puritans believed in the older idea of Calvinism, that God chose who would become a Christian and go to heaven and who would not. The Puritan approach to Christianity, while historically grounded, was very fatalistic, as they believed that individual humans had no control over their own salvation, and that God was the force that made people become Christians. The fatalism that the Puritans demonstrated can be seen in their poems, called Jeremiads, in which they denounced the moral decline in their societies, and on their tombstones, which were adorned with skulls and crossbones, to highlight the uncertainty of whether the deceased had gone to heaven or hell. As the First Great Awakening grew in power and influence over time, tombstone styles changed in the New England colonies. The old skulls and crossbones were replaced with smiling cherub angels to show that the deceased had been a believer in God and had gone to heaven. Preachers like Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield instead used showmanship and emotional appeals in their sermons to emphasize the importance of the conversion experience and the active role that individual Christians played in their own salvation. These traveling preachers played the same role in American religious culture at the time that evangelists like Billy Graham played in the 20th century. The preachers' mobile services, called camp meetings or revivals, also allowed women and African Americans to attend and participate. Whitefield in particular was very interested in converting black people, even enslaved blacks, to Christianity, a significant departure from the previous Anglo-American belief that enslaved people should not be converted, as doing so would require that they be emancipated, or at least treated less brutally in their bondage. More problematically, Whitefield believed that enslavement could be used as a system to convert African people to Christianity. To this end, Whitefield played a major role in legalizing slavery in Georgia in 1751. African Americans from the mid-1700s onward would convert to Christianity in greater numbers, but they would take a very different approach to the faith than their white masters. We will talk about African American religion in more detail in later videos. In the end, the First Great Awakening's emphasis on evangelicalism made colonial Christianity more egalitarian, and it questioned the old Anglican and Puritan power structures, helping to make the English colonies truly American and inspiring the American Revolution. More negatively, the First Great Awakening, particularly the work of George Whitefield, helped to expand slavery into Georgia, while unwittingly making slavery more of an issue of race and less one of religion or ethnicity. The final colonial crisis we will discuss in this video will be the French and Indian War. There were actually a series of 4 wars fought between the French and English colonists and their respective Native American allies. The initial 3 wars were spillover conflicts. The first was King William's War, which we discussed before, But the last French and Indian War began in America and spilled over into Europe, and indeed the rest of the world. The flashpoint of the war was the Ohio Country, a fertile land to the east of Pennsylvania and Virginia and south of the Great Lakes, roughly encompassing present-day Ohio, as well as parts of Pennsylvania, Indiana, and West Virginia. This region had many strategic and economic benefits: navigable rivers, fertile soil, wild game to hunt and trap, and Native Americans with whom the colonists could trade. Both the French and the British claimed dominion over the territory and its indigenous inhabitants. The English colonial governments, however, claimed parts of the territory separately. Colonies like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and even Connecticut stated that parts of the territory were theirs. In light of this division, Virginia, in October of 1753, sent a diplomatic expedition, a detachment of militia, to claim the Ohio Country. The commander of this expedition was a 21-year-old militia officer by the name of George Washington. Washington was an experienced backwoodsman, having worked as a backcountry surveyor during his youth, but he was relatively inexperienced as a diplomat and military commander. Washington's orders were to diplomatically order the French military to vacate the Ohio Country and to claim the territory for Virginia and Britain. Washington was also authorized to make alliances with Native American chiefs in the territory as well. During one of these meetings, the young Washington met Tenagdison, or Half-King, an Iroquois chief. Half-King traveled with Washington to his rendezvous with the French. Washington ordered the French to leave, but they politely declined the order, since they outnumbered Washington's force. Washington returned to Virginia and was promoted to lieutenant colonel, before being ordered to confront the French again in February of 1754. Washington moved his small army north into what is now Pennsylvania. Washington and his men attacked a French military detachment, killing their leader, Joseph Jumonville. Scholars think that the ambush may have been Half-King's idea, rather than Washington's. Half-King's warriors, who were fighting with the militia, scalped several of the French dead as well. Washington, for his part, blamed the attack on his translator, whom he argued had failed to communicate the French party's intentions. The French, angered at the killing of their diplomat and the mutilation of their dead, declared war on Britain, beginning the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it is known outside of the U.S. The French army advanced against Washington and the militia. In response, Washington ordered the construction of a temporary redoubt named Fort Necessity. Rather than building it on a hill, which would have given him lines of sight, Washington, showing his inexperience, built the fort in a low-lying area, allowing the French force, 900 strong, to pour musket fire down on the militia, who numbered less than 400. Washington tried to engage the French and their Native American allies outside of the fort, but they were forced to surrender on July 3, 1754. Washington, with more experience under his belt, returned to the Ohio Country in 1755 with a British regular army force led by General Edward Braddock. Braddock's army was tasked with capturing Fort Duquesne near present-day Pittsburgh. Braddock's army, trained to fight in Europe, moved slowly and made a lot of noise as it penetrated deep into the woods of the Ohio Country. To make matters worse, the British soldiers' red uniforms made them perfect targets for French and Indian snipers hiding in the bush. Braddock was skilled with logistics, but he was a poor tactician. What is more, he did not trust his Native American and colonial militia assets, leaving him without scouts and troops who knew the backcountry well. Washington's Colonial Militia Detachment became separated from Braddock's main force, and during the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9, 1755, the French attacked both Braddock and Washington, hoping to defeat the force in detail, a military term for defeating a divided enemy force, one piece at a time. Braddock's force was defeated, and he was killed in battle. Washington rallied the British troops and the militia and led a successful retreat. During the retreat, he had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his uniform became riddled with bullet holes. This experience would lead Washington to believe that God had protected him in combat, a belief he would maintain during the American Revolutionary War as well. Although Braddock's army had been defeated, Washington's bravery in combat and successful retreat helped restore some of his prestige after his failure during the Jumonville affair and the surrender of Fort Necessity the previous year. Indeed, young George Washington and the British Army's failures in the Ohio country in 1754 and 1755 were a microcosm of the British and Anglo-American colonies' early performance during the French and Indian War. The British Army and the English colonists were far less experienced with fighting on the frontier than the French were. Additionally, while the English had indigenous allies, the French enjoyed far more initial Native American support due to their colonization strategy, which we discussed in a previous video. The British were losing the French and Indian War until 1758, when political changes in England and the arrival of more skilled British generals helped to turn the war in the British Empire's favor. Additionally, the French alliances with Native Americans began to fall apart due to the high cost of maintaining these alliances. The British Army would eventually expel the French from the Ohio country, and they would defeat the French army in New France, Canada, at Quebec and Montreal in 1759 and 1760. The Spanish entered the war in 1761 on the French side, and the British, with the help of American colonial militiamen, actually invaded Cuba, capturing the wealthy port city of Havana in 1762. By this point, the war had mostly died down in America, so the colonies were able to send spare militiamen to help the mother country defeat Spain. The French and Indian War, a conflict that started out very badly for the British Empire and its colonies, became a massive victory for Britain and the American colonists. At the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France, the biggest loser in the conflict, was forced to cede all of its territory in North America. Britain gained control of the Ohio country and Canada. As a result of the war, Britain also continued its policy of forcibly removing the Francophone, French-speaking Acadians from Canada, who lived in what is now Nova Scotia. They were deported to Louisiana, where they created the Cajun culture that we know today. The Louisiana Territory, which included Louisiana, New Orleans, and a good portion of the American West, was given to Spain to compensate the Spanish for losses incurred during the war. Spain regained control of Havana, but it ceded Florida to Britain. We do not have time to discuss the other territorial changes that occurred as a result of the French and Indian / 7 Years' War. Suffice to say that Britain gained significant power and military prestige across the world during this conflict. In the Anglo-American colonies, the final French and Indian War would have a profound and far-reaching effect as well. The war had forced all of the American colonies to come together to fight an external foe in a way that they had never previously done before. Before the final French and Indian War, the colonies had fought wars separately, although they occasionally came together on a regional basis, as was done by the New England colonies during King Philip's War, and the Pequot Wars. The French and Indian War had a positive effect, as it helped to create a new American colonial nationalism, as the colonies had come together to defeat France, a major world power. It also offered many future Revolutionary War generals, like George Washington, their first experience of combat. On the more negative side, the French and Indian War strained relations between the American colonies and Great Britain, and the Native Americans. The British government and the American colonists and frontiersmen, emboldened by their victory, wanted to move into lands that had been taken away from the French. Both groups believed that Native Americans who had sided with the French during the war no longer had rights to the lands they inhabited, since they had lost the war with France. This disagreement over land use and administration would lead to Pontiac's War of 1763 through 1766, in which the British fought various Native American peoples led by Chief Pontiac in the Ohio country. Additionally, the Anglo-American colonists were fearful and mistrustful of the French Catholic colonists of Quebec, who had just been integrated into the British American Empire. The Americans were worried that the Quebecois would spread Catholicism to the Anglo colonies and threaten the safety of the Protestant communities. Protestant English colonists were still worried that Catholics would try to take over the colonies and persecute them. Rather than assuaging their fears, the British government only made the colonists angrier. The British government wanted to prevent future wars over land in North America, so the British government announced a Proclamation Line in 1763 that forbade American colonists from settling in Indian lands across the Appalachian Mountains, including the Ohio country. The primary reason America fought in the French and Indian War. The British also dispatched troops to guard the border and stop colonists from crossing over. What is more, in 1774, the British government gave the administration of the Ohio country to Quebec, and it refused to change Quebec's civil law structure into an English common law system, meaning that the Anglo-American frontiersmen squatting in Ohio would have to live under Catholic French law. The British government believed that the American colonists had caused the French and Indian War, and thus the colonists should not be allowed to expand westward, to prevent future wars with Indians. The American colonists felt that they had been betrayed by their mother country, believing that Britain was putting the needs of French Catholics and Indians over its own people. Additionally, because of the high cost of the war, the British government began to levy new taxes on goods imported to the colonies from other parts of the British Empire. This taxation, without representation, angered the American colonists, but we'll talk about these taxes in a future video. In the end, I wanted you all to see how a series of crises in colonial American history, over the course of about 80 years, helped to create a new and unified American identity, which would help to inspire the American Revolution. Many good things came out of these crises, including the end of theocracy, religious egalitarianism, and a unified sense of Anglo-American nationalism. On the negative side, these conflicts strengthened the institution of slavery, increased colonists' seizure of Native American lands, while intensifying xenophobia in the colonies as well.